In Paris, there's people who live in tiny apartments that are the size of my bathroom. And I have a pretty tiny bathroom. It's only 5 square meters, which is 54 square feet. So if you're wondering if it's actually possible or even legal, let me tell you about the crazy world of tiny apartments in Paris. So first, I want to tell you why there's so many tiny apartments in Paris. And for that, I need to tell you about this guy. So this is Haussmann, and he's the reason why Paris looks like this and has a super uniform look that I feel makes it super beautiful. So back in the 19th century, things were pretty bad in Paris. Like, the streets were super tiny, the apartments super old, dating from the medieval times, and also they were super cramped and people were constantly getting sick with like awful diseases like cholera. And to show you how bad things were, during my research I even found a quote from an 1840s doctor that said that 23 people lived in a 5 square meter room, which is 54 square feet, and as you might remember, is the exact size of my bathroom today. And I really don't know what to think of it because you'll see later in the video it's already way too small for one person. But anyways, in 1853, Haussmann comes in and is basically given full powers to expropriate anyone who stands in his way. So he goes ahead and has a lot of buildings demolished, and instead he builds these really beautiful avenues that we still have today. And just to show you how big of an impact this guy had on Paris, it is estimated that 60% of buildings in Paris today are Haussmann type buildings. And you know, from the outside, they're obviously beautiful and iconic, but from the inside, it is a whole other story. And it's also one of the reasons why people have to live in those crazy tiny apartments. Alright, so let's go see what's happening inside of this building. These Haussmann buildings are super interesting to me because they're all built in similar ways and they're made to reflect the social hierarchy of the times. So they have a ground floor that's usually a shop, then right above it, in between floors, there was the shopkeeper's apartment, and then the second floor is pretty fancy. It has a balcony and it's often called the noble floor. It's where the richest people would live in the time because, as you might remember, in the 19th century people didn't have elevators. And then, to put it simply, the 2 floors above are for the upper middle class, then the 5th floor is for lower middle class people, and then the 6th floor is the servants' quarters, which means the people who live there in the 6th floor usually work for the people from the 2nd and 3rd and 4th floors. And this is where things get a bit wild in my opinion. So these tiny servants' quarters in the 6th floor haven't changed too much since the 19th century, but they've been transformed in some of the smallest and most controversial tiny apartments in Paris that we call chambre de bonne, which means maid's room. And it's such a fascinating story to me because these maid's rooms, they've always been a source of controversy. Even at the time, they were not considered a great place to live in. And people were also getting sick regularly with tuberculosis. But it was just out of sight because if you worked as a maid in one of these fancy Haussmann buildings, you couldn't take the beautiful main staircase that doesn't even go to the 6th floor anyway. But instead, you had to take a dedicated hidden service staircase so that you are always invisible but still connected to your employer's house so that you're ready to serve them whenever they need you. Like, every apartment had a service entrance and you could literally ring a bell that would ring to the 6th floor to call your maid or the people who worked for you. And this is a really common thing even today. Like, we used to live in one of these Haussmann buildings, and as you can see in this photo, this door right here is actually closed off. It was the old service door and it was turned into a shelf. But there was a service staircase right behind this door. You know, if we listened really closely, we could hear the people climbing up to the 6th floor with a totally different staircase than the one we would take to go to our apartment. So obviously the work laws in the 19th century were not the best. So if you were a maid back then, you were not really protected by any laws. You worked really long hours. You were on call all the time. And then when you're ready to rest, you just come back to your tiny room that only has a bed and is often slanted because you're under the roofs. But also there's no heat or any type of insulation because the roofs are made of metal, which means it's super cold in winter, super hot in summer, and the walls are super thin, so you hear your neighbors all the time. So right now I'm describing what I found about the life of maids in the 19th century during my research, but I feel it also describes how it is to live in one of these tiny apartments even today. And I've personally stayed in a few of these only temporarily because they make for cheap Airbnbs. I'm gonna tell you about that in a bit. But not much has changed changed in terms of living conditions since the 19th century, except that, we got running water now. And before we move forward, I wanted to thank today's sponsor, Level 8. If you're looking for a suitcase that's both stylish and functional, you should absolutely check them out. So as you know, I'm often traveling between France and the US, and I always bring my camera equipment with me in my carry-on. So I really need a good suitcase that protects my stuff. For this video, Level 8 sent me their Hedgen suitcase, and I have to say that I'm seriously impressed. It's built with a super resistant hard shell, an aluminum frame, and even metal corners, so I know it's gonna be tough enough to handle all the traveling I'm gonna do with it. Plus, it's zipperless, which is more resistant, and feels way safer when you're navigating airports or crowded train stations. The interior is pretty nice too, with well-organized compartments to keep everything in place. So if you're looking to upgrade your travel gear, I definitely recommend checking out Level 8 and their Hedgen suitcase. Just click on the link in the description below and use my code for a discount. So here, let me show you what a few of these tiny apartments look like and how profitable they can be for landlords. So what you have to know is that in Paris, the average size of a studio is 14 square meters, which is 150 square feet, and the average rent is 850 euros a month. So, when you look at this first apartment, you're like, things are not that bad, it's tiny, but it has a beautiful, beautiful view on the Eiffel Tower in a beautiful Haussmann building, but obviously the price to buy it is really insane. Now, if we look into cheaper options, if we go smaller, just on the edge of what's legal, and I'll tell you a bit more about this in a bit. You have a maid's room, it's super tiny, 9 square meters, pretty much as tiny as you can rent legally. There's obviously no elevator and also no bathroom. The bathroom is in the hallway and it is shared with the other people who live in service rooms. But the price to buy it has already been divided by 2, which means it's way more profitable. And if you want to be a landlord but you just have a tiny budget and you don't really care about the laws, which we will see some people don't, you can buy a 6 square meter studio, and that's it. You open the door and what you see is what you get. And this tiny studio is around a quarter of the price of the first one. As you can see, those crazy tiny apartments, they can be pretty profitable, especially the ones that are really tiny and potentially illegal to rent. But we'll come back to that in a bit. So today there's around 114,000 maids room remaining. And as you can see from this map, they are mostly located in historically fancy areas like the 16th arrondissement, which has around a third of these rooms. And just to make it clear, now there's workloads and there's usually no maids living in the maids room. And you might think that these are mostly for students, but what I found really crazy is that actually students are only 12% of people who live in these rooms. Like, what I found super sad is that there's around the same proportion of lower income retirees who live there. Also, most of these tiny service rooms are under 8 square meters, which is 86 square feet, and 93% of them are under 14 square meters, which is 150 square feet. So these are really, really tiny. And I remember when I was a student, I was living on the 5th floor, and I don't know why this time the staircases were connected, but every day I could see an older grandpa who was living on the 6th floor and had to climb all the way up there every single day. And if you're like me right now, you must be thinking, like, how is it not illegal? Well, the thing is, it actually is, at least partially. So here are the rules. In France, since 2002, you cannot rent an apartment that's less than 9 square meters. That's 97 square feet. It is already pretty tiny. And as you might remember, a lot of these apartments have slanted roofs, so they only count the parts of the apartment that have a ceiling height of at least 2.2 meters, which is 7 feet 2 inches. And, they actually have a licensed home inspector come and measure the apartment and give you official paperwork. So for example, in this apartment, they are only taking into account this part where you can actually stand up. So this is how you end up with crazy, absurd situations like this guy who lives in a 0.9 square meter apartment, which is less than 10 square feet. He's paying around 250 euros a month to live his life on his knees. But there's a trick that landlords use to actually rent these crazy tiny apartments legally. They have tenants sign a temporary contract. So in Paris, there's this loophole that allows landlords to rent these tiny apartments that would be otherwise illegal to rent, only for short-term stays of less than 3 months. And this is perfectly legal if you only rent out to people who are here temporarily. For example, in this video where they're renting a 4.7 square meter apartment, which is 50 square feet, to a teacher who's only there for a month and who's paying 450 euros. And the guy has to sleep on a mattress on the floor by the door. So, you know, it's really not the best, but it's legal, and he says that it's cheaper than a hotel. And you can see in the video that he keeps a positive spirit because he's only there for a month and he knows he's gonna come back to his home anyways. But some other people are not that lucky, and we're gonna see that a bit later in the video. And by the way, this is why you see so many of these tiny apartments on Airbnb as well. So if you're coming to Paris, make sure you read the ad so that you know what to expect. The big issue though with the short-term contracts is that you don't have the same rights as with a normal contract that protects the tenants and puts a cap on how much rent you have to pay. And also some landlords will use that type of contracts to take advantage of people who are really desperate for an apartment. You know, I think it's pretty easy to get stuck in a bad situation. I was talking about in a past video how we were looking for an apartment last year, and a lot of landlords wanted us to sign a temporary contract in the hopes of taking their apartment back for the Olympic Games and then putting it on Airbnb and obviously making more money. And you really need to remember that finding an apartment in Paris is super hard. There's so many applicants per listing. You need to have a bunch of paperwork. The paperwork is so complicated. You really need to be on top of it. You often need to have a specific type of French work contract or have a guarantor that's a French taxpayer. And if you don't have that, it's gonna be super hard. And also sometimes landlords just lie on the ads and rent an apartment to someone who doesn't know their rights. Like in this video where this Italian student ends up paying 410 euros a month for 5 square meters, which is 54 square feet. And she says in the video that the ad said 9 square meters, which is the legal limit. So she was unpleasantly surprised when she arrived in Paris and saw the apartment. So yeah, just a quick tip if you're watching this and maybe you're a student or you're someone who's thinking of moving to Paris or a foreign worker. In France, you have a lot of rights, you are protected, and there's this official website of the French Public Service to do just that, that pretty much explains every one of your rights and obligations and also tells you what to do if there's a problem. I'll link it in the description. But anyways, I want to add a bit of nuance because these are extreme cases and not everything is that bad. So right now there's only 7,000 apartments that are less than 9 square meters, so illegal apartments that are used as a primary residence. It's a minority of apartments, but I feel it's already way too much. And also an interesting stat I found while researching for this video is that around 75% of these maids' room actually just sit empty most of the year. You know, it's very expensive to transform them into acceptable housing because they're just that bad. And often people who own them just keep them as an office, a storage room, or, you know, sometimes they will put their kids there when they're going to college, or even keep it as a place to sleep when they're coming to Paris, if they live in another city. And in general, there's both a housing crisis and a lot of empty apartments in Paris, but that's something for another video. And also, living in a tiny apartment is something very common in Paris because the rents are so expensive. I've lived in a tiny apartment as a student. Literally every single person I know has lived in a tiny studio apartment. Right now, I'm only living in a bigger place because I'm sharing rent with my boyfriend Bobby. And if you want to see what normal life looks for me these days, you should watch one of those videos. I'll see you there.